It has been said that if you wish to see far ahead in time, you must first look far back to find lessons from the past. The archiving of documents from the past and the present is an important source for architecture and design. It captures the passing of time. It is a testament to the evolution of the discipline. The following masterclasses record the individual processes of professionals and their ways of working.
My name is Charles Hind, and I'm the Chief Curator and Curator of Drawings at the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. I'm going to talk about the process of cataloguing an archive, but I should start getting what the Royal Institute of British Architects is. We're a professional organisation that has been in existence in 1834, and from the very beginning we have acquired drawings, archives from the 1850s, photographs, and other materials relating to the creation and to the history of architecture. What I'm going to explain is using two archives that have come into us in the last nearly 20 years or so to talk about this process of working out how we reconcile the catalogue of a collection whilst preserving the order in which an architect has created the material necessary to design a building. The collection is huge. It has probably 1 million or so drawings, several hundred models, and so on. The first drawings are 15th century. The majority, of course, are 19th, 20th century, and we continue to collect today. The two archives that I'm going to talk about are of those of Sir Dennis Lasdon, which we acquired in 2004, famous in this country for his design of the National Theatre in London, and Colin St John Wilson and Partners. Colin St John Wilson, famous for the British Library. The Lasdon archive starts in the 1930s and continues into the 1990s. The Wilson archive from the 1960s to the 2000s. Archives come into us usually in a state of some disorder. If you're lucky, when you get an archive, you get some kind of registration, a register for it, but that's not guaranteed. And in any case, it often does not reflect the archive in the state in which it is delivered to us. The first thing is to understand what exactly the archive contains. So the cataloguer needs to survey the material, understand what projects are there, what is its original order. That's something I'll come back to later on. Many architects, the papers of many architects fall into three categories. There are the projects themselves with job files. So that's the process of designing architecture. And the professional papers of an architect, many of whom belong to all sorts of bodies. And then there are the personal papers, which don't always come in, but may well reflect the family life and private life of the architect. The key thing really is to understand the thought processes of the architect and how he, she, or the practice worked. One of the differences between Lasdun and Wilson is that Lasdun worked for most of his career using sketches which were almost incomprehensible to anybody other than himself, but were understood by his model maker. And from those sketches, balsa wood models were made. And once they were agreed, whether they were designs for an entire building or just a detail of a building, drawings would be made from those models or using those models as inspiration. Models would then be thrown away. They were very ephemeral. And the formal design process, measured drawings, would be begun. Collins, Hind and Wilson, better known as Sandy Wilson, used rather more orthodox methods, designing from sketches, which will lead on to preliminary drawings, and then working drawings, and so on. It's also important to understand what filing system the practice used. Cataloguing, the cataloguing structure reflects the office order. In the case of Wilson, they used three letters, to abbreviate the project. So LUC was Lucas Industries, BLB was the British Library in its first incarnation, or first proposed incarnation, in Bloomsbury, and then BLE was in the project that was finally built at Euston. Competitions into which many architects enter projects often don't fit into the system at all. In the case of Wilson, for example, the Copenhagen Opera House, and that is not given what I suppose CUH it might otherwise have been. That just has a running number. And for Lasdun, the Herver Synagogue drawings don't even have any numbers at all. One of the things that the cataloguer really needs to do is to research the project. So having established what's in the archive generally and started to break it down, is to look at the individual project to understand the process of design for that particular project and what order the material naturally fits into. When it comes to cataloguing, and of course the catalogue is the key to understanding, for the researcher to understand what is in an archive. We, and I think most archives, don't use the office numbering system for a number of reasons. Firstly, the office number may not reflect the sequence of drawings because, and I'll come on to this later, an archive may have been weeded either by the architect's office or by the collecting institution, in this case the RIBA. But what is important is that you do use the office numbering system to try and establish the chronology of the material that you're cataloguing. The order in which traditionally we've catalogued starts with concept sketches. These are very rarely numbered unless you have an architect who takes particular care and particularly values this early material. Then you move on to the design development, at which point you'll get an office order that's usually a stamp with a code and a date and some brief description of what the drawing represents. Then you move on to the presentation drawing. Usually this doesn't fit into the numbering system at all, a perspective or series of perspectives. Then, assuming the project is given the go-ahead, it's a case of moving on to the working drawings, which contain, often these are the majority of the drawings, because they are the most numerous. They're needed to work up the project. It's often the working drawings where weeding becomes most apparent. Many of the drawings may seem to be extremely repetitive. Archives are always aware of the issue of space. And I'll just divert slightly to talk about the weeding issue. Some people believe that it is wrong to weed an archive at all, that every scrap of paper should, as far as possible, be retained. This often isn't practical for reasons of space and resources, staff, time, and so on. It's very important right at the beginning, and often if the architect is still alive, to agree the criteria on which the subsequent weeding will proceed. If you're dealing with an elderly architect, it may well be that by the time the cataloguing is undertaken, the architect is no longer around. And it is also important, where possible, to discuss with the architect what is the most significant material that is in the archive. So you get advice from the architect as to what he or she feels is important and should be retained, which you balance against the requirements of the archive in terms of space and resources. One of the things that I think a curator needs to recognize is that whatever decision you make, your successors will almost undoubtedly wish that you had made a different decision. In the case of, for example, the RIBA, the first major archive that the Institute took in was that of Sir Edwin Lutyens, who was the greatest British architect of the first half of the 20th century, at a time just after the Second World War, when the drawings collection of the Institute sort of barely existed as a separate department. It was just a collection of drawings in the library. And although they set weeding criteria, which was possibly the first time this had ever been done, out of the 80 or so thousand drawings which were available, only about 10% was retained. These days, we would have taken a very different view, and a far, far greater proportion would have been retained. Also, the needs of researchers, or the interests of researchers, change. A material which might seem of no interest now might well turn out to be of interest later on. And another example, the Victorian architect Alfred Waterhouse, his pioneering Gothic revival, Manchester Town Hall in the 1850s and 1860s was one of the first public buildings to use hydraulic lifts. And at the time that archive came in, nearly 40 years ago, that kind of technical material wasn't retained, and it wasn't understood how important these lifts were in the history of technology and its integration into architecture. So this comes back to my earlier point about how important it is to really research your project and understand what is important about the material that is being offered. Once you've agreed the weeding criteria and the material is then sorted, I think it is, it's our practice that we note separately, but not in the catalogue record, what material is to be disposed of. Then the process of cataloguing begins. And obviously different institutions use different cataloguing systems, but what is really essential is to try and bring the material together in its various media. So if you're talking about a traditional analog archive, you'll have drawings, photographs, models, archival items, bound reports, and so on. It is very important that if somebody is researching a particular architecture or a particular building, that they understand from the catalogue what material is available in the different parts of the institution, because of course different materials require different storage facilities, and you will not keep photographs, and ideally you don't keep photographs in the same conditions as you would drawings. Also, ideally, the cataloguer, having understood what a project consists of, will include in the catalogue a brief account of that building. Now, it may be a very well-known building which requires very little research. On the other hand, it may be a building in which there is little evidence other than what the archive provides. But if possible, some kind of brief account of the building should be provided in a footnote. Certainly in the RIBA's case, because space is at a premium, we have to divide material to store it by size. And this is something we occasionally have to explain to readers why, when they're researching a particular project, even though there is a numerical sequence, let's say from 1 to 100, it is in different locations, because large drawings go in large portfolios or into tubes, and smaller drawings go into smaller portfolios, or if they're particularly precious or are a conservation issue, they may well go into boxes. So what the researcher sees when they come in having said, I want to see everything on this building, they may get a rather disparate pile of materials, which of course could include models. Latterly, although we have, as an institute, not yet fully developed our collecting of digitally born material, that's something else that will have to be factored into the mix. I think the hardest thing to wrap up is to try and anticipate what it is that a reader will look at in years to come. I've already mentioned this issue about weeding. It's also, we find that we have all sorts of people looking at material. It isn't just architects. They are about a quarter of our users. But it's also architectural historians and scholars, who are probably about 60%. But the remaining 10% or so are a huge range of people. They could be literary historians, family historians, people who are just looking up a local building because they're interested in it. They might be looking up a building they work in or they live in. The older material, we've had novelists researching plans of Victorian houses and so on. You can't really predict, but the key thing really is to provide information that whatever your user is intending to look at will enable the reader to find the material that they want. And I say that prediction is, in a way, the hardest part of our job. But we have to all, as archivists, as curators, we just have to do our best.